welcome to Gimme Empathy. This is a podcast hosted by me, Scott Mercer. I'm a musician and a community radio person, and I have a day job, and I make this every 2 weeks. And my guest this week is Brook Heath Bacon. Now, how do I know Brook Heath Bacon? I've known him for about a year now, and he is the dungeon master in the game of Dungeons and Dragons that I play. So there might be some words there that you're not familiar with, so let me break it down. Dungeons and Dragons, or D&D, is a fantasy tabletop role-playing game. What does that mean? Okay, so it's a game played by a group of people sitting around a table, and everyone takes on a character with their own particular abilities and statistics. And the dungeon master is a part of the game, but it's not a player. So I guess think of like the banker in Monopoly, except instead of distributing cash and giving you hotels, they guide you along a semi-improvised story in a fantasy realm. I'd been interested in playing D&D for quite a while. I'd heard it being played on podcasts, and it always sounded really fun. And last year, I got the chance to get involved with a game. And when I started playing, the thing I found, as you'll hear in this conversation, is that it's less like Monopoly and more like a kind of improvised game you might play in drama class, or even in like an ice-breaking exercise at uni or at work or something. So there's an element of story, but there are also rules, and it's the dungeon master's job to more or less make sure that the players are following those rules. And there is an element of chance to the game in the form of a number of dice that you roll to determine whether your actions are successful or not. So the player might say, I walk into the tavern, and then the dungeon master will describe the scene that greets you in the tavern, perhaps if anyone comes up to greet you, or if you get into a bar fight immediately. And if you get into that fight and you throw a punch, are you successful in landing that punch? That's what the dungeon master does in a nutshell. I can't remember if I've mentioned that I played D&D before on the podcast. I know I usually feature people involved in the local music scene on Gimme Empathy, but I was actually a nerd a long time before I was a musician, and I will probably go back to being a big nerd after my work in music is done, or should my capacity to be involved in music be reduced. And I guess it was kind of a formative subcultural influence on me growing up. I didn't really get into cool music until I was in my late teens. So I guess what I'm trying to say is this episode does get very nerdy, but I'd like to hope that we kept the conversation at least relatively accessible. D&D is not a new game. It's been around since the 1970s, but in recent years it seems to have undergone a bit of a spike in popularity in the mainstream. So if you've ever been curious about it, or concerned, as some people were in the 80s, that it involves satanic rites or is dangerous, you might find this conversation interesting. So here it is, episode 54. With Brook Heath Bacon.
Yeah, no, it was. And more to that as well is we have built over creeks. And one of the worst ones, which is a common flooding area, is in the Rosalie Milton area. We literally built over a creek. It still sort of exists nearer the river. You can find remnants at the end of it, but yeah, we just filled it in. But the thing is, the water doesn't disappear, so that's why that is a really bad flooding area. And that was kind of the problem, was that they ended up trying to, well, I think this is part of the history of Australia, and you could say it's the larrikin spirit, but the basically, some people who may or may not have had some money behind them decided that they should subdivide and sell that sort of swampland to working people. And
Suckers.
Yes, to put it in another term. And yeah, that's what happened, is that now we are paying the price for that greed. Yeah. But hey, look, that's part of Australia's history, and continuing to be.
So, did you say before your dad was he also built houses? So like an architect?
No. So I guess before we get into the nitty-gritty of it all, technically speaking, I have my qualification as through architecture. I have a master's in architecture. But through the machinations of the world, I am now a building designer. Building design, you can actually achieve that by going to TAFE, and it's a different process. There's a bit of a war that goes on between architects and building designers.
What exactly is the distinction?
The distinction, generally speaking, is that architects have done 6 years of university study, and some might say that they hold themselves in a high regard because of that. They feel that the training that they've received is broader and possibly might result in a better trained individual. Building designers have, I guess, an approach where, yes, their training is different, but it seems that a lot of building designers are very focused on functionality and, I guess, the nuts and bolts of how a building goes together. And that's really where the discrepancy lies, is some architects don't see building designers as particularly talented or skilled, and some building designers feel that architects are very good at artistic stuff, but when it actually comes to making a building that stays standing and operates properly, they may not be as skilled.
Interesting. So is it a bit like how Kat and I went to TAFE and we're qualified library technicians, but Philip went to uni, right, and is an actual librarian?
Yeah, but do you have street battles at night over it?
Yeah, well, after all our D&D games, Kat and I...
it's the same thing.
Beat up Philip, yes.
Like, and a lot of T-squares are broken, but that's just the way it is, art life.
So going into architecture, was that at all influenced in your dad's line of work?
Yes. Yes and no. My father tried his very best to dissuade me from going into architecture. At one point, he was recommending that I should be a used car salesman.
Why?
He felt that I had reasonable
child?
people skills, so obviously that means you should sell, in inverted commas, immaculate vehicles to consumers, or otherwise known as idiots.
Those suckers again.
God, there's so many. But no, well, I guess the full back story of it all is that I originally went into uni with the idea that I was going to do medicine. I did a science degree that was specialised in biomedical science, and while I was doing that, the only job I could get was through my father. He had purchased a copy of a program called Revit, and this was when Revit was brand new. And basically he came to me and he said, look, if you can learn this program, I'll give you a job, because he was struggling. And so I did. I sat down, I learned Revit and got a job. And so from that, and drawing plans every day of houses, I developed an interest in it, and I realized that I actually really quite liked doing that. So I got to the end of my science qualification, and I did the GAMSAT. But at that point, I realized that my heart really wasn't in it, and I made a decision at that point to say no. I think I will enjoy my working life more if I go into architecture.
That's a pretty big decision to make. I'm not sure and I think there are a lot of people out there who aren't necessarily able to to really judge at that point, this is the thing I've been working for, but what is the opportunity? Is this a sunk cost thing? Do I only want to do this thing because I've been pursuing it so long? And there's this other thing I think I'm actually going to enjoy, and they're sort of able to take that opportunity.
Yeah, my parents, my family is originally from New Zealand, and basically the sole purpose of my family moving from New Zealand to Australia, as my parents always said, was to give myself and my brother an opportunity to go to university. At that time in New Zealand, there was a very bad recession on, and obviously it's different over there, and particularly at that time, there were less opportunities for people to be able to go to university. I don't believe they had the same level of hex support as they did in Australia. But I was a bit young to understand the full extent of it, but I was told effectively that it would be very financially challenging for both my brother and I to go to university, and my parents weren't comfortable with that. They're both very hard workers and had to work very hard to get to where they were, and they, I think, were confronted quite often with the fact that things may not get any easier, so the best thing to do is to have a university qualification behind you to ensure that you can possibly do a job that you might enjoy. And so I think that was one of the things. I know that there's still, probably to this day, my parents would like me to give it a go back and do medicine, but realistically, a lot of their encouragement was you should do something that you enjoy so that you can enjoy your working life as well as your private life. And, you know, as they say, if you enjoy what you do,
you'll never work a day in your life, mate.
Exactly. That is a lie. But it certainly, it means that there's a decent portion of your working life that you can enjoy.
Were you interested in drawing like maps and plans of things when you were a kid?
I was very interested in drawing as a kid. There's quite a few people in my family who come from artistic backgrounds, or they themselves were artists. So I can remember being taught how to watercolor with my grandfather.
Wow.
And he was a very good artist. And one of my aunts, she was quite renowned at one point, and she still paints to this day, and she does fantastic work. So there was a lot of encouragement with the drawing side of it. Also, just in general, from the creative side of things, my mother is a piano teacher and a music theory teacher. So she's obviously very much from a creative background. And it was just part of me growing up. I just loved drawing. I loved anything to do with that. And it was a bit of a passion of mine.
When I was a kid, I liked drawing, and I especially liked drawing maps and building plans and layouts and stuff. But I was very bad at it, and I guess I didn't have that family of artists sort of thing going on. But I remember one of the things I would love drawing is, you know how on old Super Nintendo games there would be world maps, like in Mario World and Donkey Kong Country and stuff. I used to love drawing world maps, and because in Donkey Kong Country all the levels were puns. Or just, you know, alliteration. And I loved making up new ones of them. But it's just scribble in ink pen in Notepad. Like, it's not aesthetic to look at all.
No, absolutely. I can remember as a kid every now and again drawing a map, and I would get stupidly excited about discovering something that might be in the map. Like, I might draw a little cove, and I'd be like, oh, what's going on in this cove? And there was no reason to get excited. It's completely fake, and I literally just made it. But it was that moment of thinking, oh, there could be something interesting going on there. Maybe I should find out what it is.
Well, what were your inspirations early on?
I'd say G.I. Joe, He-Man, Transformers, you know, the classics. That was what I was drawing on a lot as a kid. I watched a lot of cartoons as a kid. Captain Planet, Widget the World Watcher, you know. Also, pretty much anything that Jim Henson ever made, I have seen probably a million times. So that certainly was a lot of where I was coming from as a child, and where I would be drawing inspiration from, drawing fantasy things and people holding swords, lots of holding swords. Everyone had a sword in their hands. Didn't really matter who they were. And as I moved into my later teenage years, I was fortunate enough to be in with a group of friends who got into anime, and that became a big part of my life at that point. And so all the art that I did around that time forward was me trying to do anime style drawing. I bought a whole lot of books to learn, and tried to copy things that I found. And at one point I was getting reasonably good at it, but nothing super startling.
So would you draw like characters?
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
I would just think of a scene in my mind, and for me, any art form that I engage with, it's a lot of it has to do with an emotion that's behind it. It's trying to express an emotion or create an emotion. So It might be a scene of I did a picture of a young girl who discovered a magical little light that was in her hands, and she was really surprised by it. And again, it's probably me drawing on my complete fascination of Ghibli and anything to do with Miyazaki. But that's just one example. All of the stuff that I do would be a scene that spoke about something, an experience or a feeling or something like that.
So even from a young age, that's how you were approaching it?
Yes.
Wow. Yeah. I never would have thought to do that. It was like, look, this is an island, and then there's another island, and there could be a bridge going between them. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah. No, well, I guess it's just the way I saw the world. At one point, I even made an actual comic strip, which was really only meant to be, I guess, well, originally it started off as an exercise for myself because I was interested in the way people make comics and that whole process. So to learn, I started making a comic. And it really was only meant as a joke for a friend of mine. And so the whole thing was just in jokes. If anyone else read it, it would make 0 sense. But yeah, we really enjoyed it. And it was just one of those ones. I got to the end of it, and I certainly enjoyed the process, but I also realized how long it took me to do it. And I'm a little bit impatient at times. So I was like, maybe not anymore. I gave it a go, but it's a bit slow for my liking.
But so how much effort did you put into it? Like, was it, with full professional looking lettering, and did you color it? And
well, at quite a young age, I became fascinated with Photoshop. So I was hand drawing each cell. I would then scan it into my computer and then use Photoshop to put the lettering over the top. It wasn't colored or anything, but yeah, it was just a black and white sketch basically. But I tried as best as I could to make it look interesting. And as I said, because it was an exercise to try and learn about comics, I would think about each cell and what the cell was trying to do and what I could do to make it either look interesting or funny. And so, yeah, that was what I was trying to achieve. And I think on some levels it was successful, but as I said, it was just a bit of a slow process for my liking.
I also made a comic strip in school to entertain my friends. It was nowhere near as elaborate. It was just all stick figures. And I did quite a few of them, though. It was called Fool. And the main character he was just a stick figure, but his distinguishing feature was that he had spiked up hair, just a bunch of lines going over his head. And it was essentially a South Park ripoff, because by the end of every strip, he would die in some horrifically violent way. And there would also often be in jokes referring to my friends in school. And I'd just draw them in class. It was not did not go to that sort of efforts you did, I think.
Fair enough. And yeah, speaking of increasing the speed of art, that ended up why I got into photography and ended up becoming a semi-pro photographer. I love photography. It's fantastic because of literally how fast it is. You can take a photo and look at the back of the camera screen and it's like right there. And you're like, ooh, I did that. Or that, this looks bad. This looks good. I'll try it again. So yeah, it's pretty addictive in that respect of the super fast response time. And again, that sort of relates to my Photoshop stuff as well. I very much love going in and tweaking photos and usually erasing things that accidentally got in the photo, some random photo bomb of a pigeon. Be like, no, sorry, mate, not this time.
Well, I guess I was going to say that, like, photography, you have less control than in drawing and painting and stuff, because you're not creating a thing from scratch. You're finding something in the world and capturing it. But these days, I guess with so much manipulation that goes on after the fact, there is kind of still that level of creation to it.
Yeah, photography is kind of a strange one because you really need to train your eye to see the world a little differently. It's all about capturing light, and that's where it starts to get interesting. Is a good exercise that quite often a lot of photography schools do is they encourage students to go out and just take one photo for that week, just one, no more. And what it's forcing people to do is be critical of what they're looking at and really assess something. And when you take a photo, obviously you are, within a press of a button, creating an image. But obviously there are aspects of that image, just like any piece of classical art or whatever, you need to think about, okay, so am I following, say, the rule of thirds or some sort of Fibonacci spiral, or are there perspective lines that's being emphasized in this image? So as you're looking at it, you've got to try and figure that out. And sure, you can see it probably a little bit better in the viewfinder, but once you press that button, that's basically it. And yes, you can use Photoshop to manipulate photos to any degree you want. But obviously the more traditional way of teaching photography is it's best to get the scene correct before you press the button.
Oh, yeah. I think that principle goes for most forms of art. And
probably, yes. But even so, like, there are extremely prolific photographers who have really lent into photo manipulation, and that's just as valid as an art form. But even that still requires some level of artistic eye and criticism of a situation. You say, well, I could do this effect and make it look like this, but what is it really saying, and what effect is it creating at the end of the day, or am I just fluffing around with Photoshop filters?
Did you read a lot of fantasy and sci-fi when you were young?
Well, to the horror of my family and probably surprise of many of my friends, I am one of the worst read fiction people you'll ever meet. I nearly only read nonfiction, partly to do with my interests, but there's been very few fiction books that I've picked up and read and I've really engaged with. Maybe it's because I find myself to be a very visual person. So maybe if they made that book into an anime, I'd watch it maybe many times. But yeah, I'm really not good when it comes to reading fiction.
That's interesting. I've sometimes come across people who are like that. I think I'm the opposite. I struggle a lot more with nonfiction, except biographies. Biographies are kind of the only thing that aren't so hard, just because they are a story. But more, I don't know, nonfiction is just kind of, I wish I could be better at it, but it's just dry and I get bored, which is bad because that's where all the worthwhile information is in nonfiction, I suppose. But so what is more visual about nonfiction that you don't find in fiction?
Well, to be honest, usually, dare I say it, images and diagrams.
Oh, right.
I guess, and this is also part of me as a person. There is part of me that just loves science, loves figuring out why something is the way it is, how it works. And so that paired with my interest in art, it does have a bit of a strange outcome where if I'm looking at a book of a famous architect, and I just love pulling apart, what have they done? How have they done that? That's a beautiful material. What is it? Why have they used this material in this way? And so there is sides of nonfiction books, whether it be history or learning about a technique or something, where for me I can read that and go, okay, can I apply this in some capacity? And yeah, so that's kind of where it comes from. In saying that, obviously I watch quite a lot of anime, so for just pure fantasy stories or creative stories, that I guess that's where I would be drawing from most of the time.
Well, what have you been reading lately?
What have I been reading lately? Oh boy. So I started up on two, this is going to be against the grain, but two fiction books from Matt Colville, who will probably get mentioned later in our discussion, but he is a writer as well as a game designer, and he's now, I guess you could say, famous for his Kickstarter and Twitch programs and YouTube videos. But that they are fantasy stories that he's written, and which the way he spoke about them, I thought was interesting. He tried to go for something that would be a combination of I guess, of the real world and a bit more of a gritty angle on fantasy. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I'm reading through those at the moment. And yes, the other one at the moment is a book on materiality, which is talking about the use of bricks and different finishes within Australian architecture.
Wow.
Yeah.
So did this guy start as a game designer and then move into fiction?
Well, I believe that he always was aiming to be a writer. And so being a writer, he eventually got taken into game design. He's worked for quite a number of prolific companies, and I think at one point he was working with a tabletop RPG company, and then he ended up working in computer game. I think Turtle Rock Studios is one that he's worked with, but he's been on quite a lot of games, and I think he also worked on a couple of board games as well at one point.
Okay.
So he's sort of he's been involved in a lot of different things, but being a writer, obviously, that's a very useful skill that you can apply across lots of different mediums. But I guess the way I found out about him was actually through D&D, because he's been a DM for almost his whole life, and he put together a video series on YouTube called Running the Game, which is, I think, an excellent resource for anyone who's wanting to learn how to DM, particularly for those people out there who are a little bit confronted by the process and think, oh, maybe I can't do it. Watch this series of videos and then see if that's the case.
Oh, okay.
They are really... He breaks it down into very little chunks that I would think that anyone who's interested in running the game would be able to do it.
Did you play many board and tabletop games when you were young?
Yeah, I did. Initially, there's the classics, which hopefully, I don't have to play much anymore. But they're, Monopoly, Connect 4, that sort of rubbish. But as I got into my teenage years, I started playing Warhammer, particularly Warhammer 40k.
Oh,
yeah.
You must have been rich to play that game.
No, actually, I was exceptionally fortunate because I had two friends who were really into it, and between them, I think they had about 4 separate armies that they had bought and painted.
Wow.
So all I had to do was buy a couple of commander units. I was playing the Dark Angels, just so you know. And yeah, I just bought the commanders, and then I could use their miniatures for the rest of my army. So I kind of got off pretty light. But yes, looking at the prices of some of those miniatures, for a young person, it's quite intense.
There are a few fads that swept through my nerd friend group throughout school. Like first sort of end of primary school was the Pokemon trading card game.
Nice.
And that evolved pretty natural progression to Magic the Gathering in high school. And I was part of both of them. But then some of us got into Warhammer 40k in high school. And that's kind of where I drew the line, I think, because I started to have other interests, but also it was just so damn expensive. I mean, the look of the units and the lore of that world was always very interesting because it's just so over the top. And was the term grimdark invented for 40k?
Oh, I'm not sure.
It's certainly an exemplar of the format. So for those not familiar, Warhammer 40,000 is a fantasy sci-fi universe set 40,000 years in the future, I guess. And it's a galaxy spanning conflict between the human Imperium, which is led by an undead god guy, and then there's also orcs whose technology only works because they believe in it. There's like Eldar and weird future elves, and everything is pain and torment all the time, but to a degree that it's kind of ridiculously funny.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's particularly I have friends who are still into that whole world, and when you start digging into how, for example, a space marine works, I think they've got like 5 hearts and 12 lungs, and it's just like they were effectively built to be gigantic humans that could just survive anything. To be honest, when you're playing on a tabletop, they don't last as long as you'd like. But still, the lore behind it is deep, and you can you can really get into it if you want to.
And there's heaps of books and
I read Inquisitor back in the day, one of the very few fiction books that I've read. But yeah, it's It's the only thing is, well, these days it's actually not so bad, because if you go on eBay and places like that, there are people who've, like, inverted commas, grown out of the hobby, who then need to sell their armies. So you can actually buy huge armies for not that much money these days.
Oh, okay, if you don't mind secondhand ones that are already painted.
Yeah,
kind of thing.
but in all fairness, they're better than what I could have done. So,
Did you play many RPGs?
well, the RPGs really only ever played on computer systems. I cut my teeth on King's Quest and Quest for Glory, the really good stuff like that. And then eventually I moved into some console gaming, playing a bit of Final Fantasy, Phantasy Star, that sort of thing. And eventually, most of my RPG gaming ended up a balance between PC gaming and console gaming. Probably the worst offender is probably Skyrim, Elder Scrolls V. I have played that game a lot.
I greatly enjoy Bethesda games, but I haven't finished one since Fallout 3.
Yeah, that's all right. I'm probably equally as bad in that camp.
And I've sunk dozens of hours into these games, though. Never finished. Do you find yourself loyal to franchises?
No, not really. The only franchise I've ever really, I could say I've been loyal to would have to be Civilization. The Civilization series is the only one that I've tried a lot of other sort of 4X games, but nothing has really scratched that itch like Civilization. So that's probably the only one that I'm particularly sort of a fanboy of. A lot of the others, I'll give it a go, but yeah, Civ, that's special.
Are they up to Civ 6 now?
Yes,
yeah.
Civ 6.
How's that one compare?
To be honest, I haven't had time this year to play much of it, so I can't really give you a good review on that. But it looks nice. Well, it looks different. But yeah, most of my hours of late have been Civ 5.
Right, yeah, Civ 3 was my main one. I think I played more hours of Civ 3 than absolutely any other game.
Yeah, that was a particularly good one.
Yeah, and I tried to get into Civ 4 a bit, but I think that itch had just like actually fallen off my brain by that point.
Fair enough.
Is D&D the first tabletop RPG you played?
I would say yes, like a pure RPG system. Yes, it is. And just as a disclaimer, I am very new to it. I've known about D&D for a very long time, but I think one of the issues for me was I hadn't seen people playing D&D the way that I would want to play it. And for a very long time, I was very interested in it, and I would look at people's games and try and get an idea of how it's working, but it just didn't really grab me. And then probably more recently, I was starting to come up against D&D again, I guess through the relatively recent board game renaissance that we're going through right now. It's hard not to bump into D&D every now and again. And again, I started looking into it, but generally I was coming across people playing it online. And again, there was something about it that just was missing, and it just didn't really grab me. Particularly, so often you see on Twitch streams and things, all the different camera views of people, and you'll have the person who's talking, the player who's currently engaged with the DM's talking, and then it's going to be a raffle as to what everyone else is doing, and usually it's one person who looks like they're clearly playing another game on their computer, and a person who's checking their phone, and the expressions on their face are very similar to the expression that people have when they're playing World of Warcraft. And I was like, well, they don't even look like they're having fun. So is it any good? Yeah. So that all changed about 3 years ago while I was searching for what I would call my preferred method of D&D. I came across Critical Role.
Which is a YouTube series where voice actors play Dungeons and Dragons.
Yes. And it was at that point, everything clicked. I saw that and I was like, this is it. They've got music, They're all sitting around a table. They're all really engaged with each other. The story is interesting. It's almost like a show that they're putting on. And they genuinely looked like they were having a great time. And I thought, yes, that's what I want to do. So I tried my very best, as limited as I am, but I tried my best to emulate what Matt Mercer does. And so here we are.
It's interesting mentioning World of Warcraft before, that because I think they're two very different sides of the RPG coin. Like World of Warcraft, to me, it seems like it's a numbers game, and it's totally fine. But it's all about getting the best loot and min-maxing things and getting the right strategies to beat the quests and the enemies in the most efficient way possible. Whereas Dungeons and Dragons, to me, feels much more about the narrative and the characters that you build along the way. And like, I enjoy both those kinds of games at various times, but I can't really imagine enjoying D&D if I were going through it just trying to absolutely win the best way every time. I think that would be a bit boring.
Well, true. I mean, every group is different. And that's the other side of D&D, is that it's extremely versatile in that sense. But at its core, D&D is collaborative storytelling. And that's, I think, something that is unique to it as well, is that it can dynamically react to player decisions and DM decisions in a capacity that nothing else can. No matter how big of a sandbox you're playing in a PC game, there is still going to be a point where the developers didn't account for X. And that's where D&D comes to the fore. And so if you want to do something that seems completely crazy, you can do it. Or it may only be something small that you want to do, but you can do it.
To the point where, like, you can totally abandon your quest and become innkeepers if you want. And
exactly.
That can be the game.
Yes, you can try and relive Friends as the D&D version, yeah. But that's the thing. It's fantastic in that respect as well. As I was saying, you can tailor the game to suit the people who are playing. And yes, there are some people out there who want to min-max. They want to do the biggest amount of damage. They want to be the most dangerous character around. And for those players, there's nothing wrong with that kind of fun. And it's great. And that really works well when they are with a group of people who are all on board with that. And the DM is aware of that. And so, yeah, you start playing the game from more of a strategic, tactical sense, trying to really just maximize the efficacy of your play style. And yeah, look, that's just as much fun for them as it is for other people. I know another RPG system that I had looked into, Burning Wheel. I was watching some games of people playing that, and it was pretty much entirely political intrigue. And these people were really getting into it. They were, trying to manipulate barons and, figure out who's the spy and blah, blah, blah. And it was all intrigue. And at the time I was thinking, well, for these people, that's great. But I know for some people that would get really dry.
Yeah.
So yeah, D&D has that ability to just morph into whatever you need it to be. And that's another big bonus of it.
Like when we started playing last year, it felt less like any other tabletop game I'd played before, which is not many. It felt more like being in grade 9 drama class again and on an extended improv thing.
Well, that's the thing. That is a big part of particularly way that Critical Role play. Obviously, they are voice actors from an acting background, but the idea of improvisational acting and the yes and approach to playing, that is definitely a big part of that style of playing D&D. And yes, it is, I guess, to an extent, acting in a way, but the flip side of it as well is that if you're a person who's maybe not comfortable with role-playing or acting in front of other people, it doesn't mean that you can't engage in the game to a high level. But yeah, it sort of goes both ways. You can have people who are very into the acting and theatrics of it all, and then you might have people who have to rely on the mechanics of the game to be able to do those theatrical things. And that's also where a DM should step in and be able to fill in those gaps for both players and say, okay, you can do this amazing theatrical thing, but these are the rules, so this is how it plays out. And then you'll have a person who's not comfortable doing all the theatrics, and a DM says, okay, and then your character pulls out their sword and it bursts into flames. And yeah, so you can accommodate both ends of the spectrum, but yes, it definitely has that theatrical side to it.
And those are two kinds of players that you actually can accommodate in the same game. And yeah, the cooperative thing is also key, I think, because it's not a game that pits you against the other players, and I don't think I'd quite thought of the ramifications of that when I started playing, because most games, there's a winner. There's no winner. Well, if you quote unquote win in D&D, it's all of you win, and then you go on to the next challenge. And it's very team building and seems very wholesome in a way that you are. I mean, your personal character may have their own little quests and agendas and moods and things, but you are generally working towards the same goal. And it was like, wow, like my mum would like playing this if there weren't so many goblins and things. Like,
yeah, well, I guess that touches on a couple of things. Like, firstly, yes, I mean, D&D is actually, well, because it is storytelling, it is intrinsically human. Storytelling has been part of humanity before books, before writing. We told stories to entertain each other and tell our history and share our culture. And there is something about explaining to someone an entertaining story that we find this deep yearning to hear more and be more engaged. It's hard to put your finger on it, but it's so much fun to hear a juicy story coming from a friend. And so D&D certainly taps into that. And as well, yeah, it's like collaborative escapism, where people can be brought together through shared experiences. And because it is quite often in your mind's eye, it becomes more real. And at the end of the day, your character's experiences really do feel like your experiences. And so, yeah, it does have this deeper side of it that it's just so engaging, and it's so much fun to be going through all of the story and moments with your friends around the table. And a big part of D&D actually isn't at the table. Anyone who's played D&D for any decent amount of time, telling stories in the car park afterwards or at the bar the following day, people will talk about the things they've been through or their characters have been through as if they themselves actually did it. And it's fantastic. People sharing stories, and again, it just has this ripple effect.
Some of my favorite subreddits are just D&D stories.
No, exactly. Some people can just end up in the wackiest situations.
Yeah. So I think a big thing that helps is having a dungeon master who does make an immersive world and puts in a lot of effort. And you seem to put in a lot of effort, because so our D&D campaign, it doesn't take place in the official in any of the official settings, Forgotten Realms or anything. So you've made your own world called Umria, where the action takes place, which is and so Umria is the continent, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's a continent divided by many kingdoms, big long history that we got when we first started, and the most recent significant event is that the royal family of this empire was assassinated all at once at a wedding. Yeah, and so the kingdom's been the empire's been shattered into these little duchies and things, and there's a lot of political conflict going on. And so there's a few things that you do to make it immersive. There's all this backstory. Whenever we travel to a new place, there's you've got a little prepared paragraph of, you travel on this, the city looks like this, the architecture's like this. There's music that you bring along. You set up to a little Bluetooth speaker taken from, I guess, fantasy games and soundtracks and stuff. And then there's the maps, which is just amazing. You've created these maps, like, of the world, of the towns. Like, why do you put so much effort into it, Brook?
That's a good question.
Do you often ask yourself that?
No, well, I know the answer to that. And this sort of this harps back to why I originally got into D&D. I was finding that obviously, yeah, throughout my university years, and all good uni students know this, that you just have more time to do more things at uni. Whether it's procrastination time or whether it's just general, I have more free time. But I found at uni, obviously, I was able to do more of my art. I could do more photography. I was doing other things outside of what I was supposed to be studying. And yeah, I found that now that I'm out of uni and I've been working, I just wasn't getting enough creative outlet in my life. And I was starting to feel very agitated and frustrated, and I just thought to myself, well, there's got to be a way. There's got to be a way to be able to express myself. And I was also at that point starting to toy with the idea of maybe I should give writing a go. Coming from a person who has read as little fiction as I have, it seems pretty ridiculous to start writing things because the chance of it being good, probably not high. So when I was looking into D&D and I could see how Matt Mercer played, I thought, well, wait a minute, this is everything. This is writing. This is, I can create things. I can design maps. I can, even if I wanted to, I can, say, draw up a house for a person in my world. I may or may not have done that.
Our party does have a house now. We got a house in the city with although there's no scale, Brook. I don't know how big everything is.
Well, that's part of the fantasy. But no, it really allowed me to just dive into a world of creativity that I didn't have access to before. And I must admit, I'm a little bit addicted into doing creative things. So, yeah, for me, finding time to do these things, well, it's not much of a chore. It's a massive enjoyment for me. And also, I've been accused occasionally of being a perfectionist. So when I draw a map, I look at it, I think, no, it can be better. And then I'll redraw it and say, no, that can be better. And eventually you end up with an A1 size map of the entire world. So yeah, no, there's certainly some aspects where it is definitely me driving the amount of work that I put into it. And yeah, you don't have to do that to enjoy it by any means, but I just love it.
So you say in uni you kind of discovered you had more free time to put into these creative pursuits. With the campaign that we're playing in D&D now, is this all original stuff you've made up just for this campaign, or is any of it stuff you've worked on before?
No, it's all original for this campaign. I'm probably drawing on things that I've thought about in the past, but no, for this particular one, everything has been put together just for this. And yeah, I've been following the tutorials that I've mentioned before online on YouTube and try to get well, the aim is to try and create a world that has a sense of reality to it. And all you need, and this is probably a little bit behind the curtain, but all you really need is to prepare enough that your players can't see behind the curtain. They can keep exploring and they just keep going, and it seems like the world goes on forever, but there is a limit. And sometimes, yes, on the fly, you have to very quickly react to what your players are doing and come up with something that makes it seem like the horizon keeps going.
Like in Skyrim, how there are mountain ranges everywhere because the entire world hasn't in fact loaded, and it's the time that takes to walk around the mountain that will load the rest of the world.
Precisely, and also as you're playing, you are building the world. So I didn't come up with everything at the very beginning. I just started off with a town, and then I figured out, okay, we're going to be moving towards another town. So I made the next town and the next town, and so as we've been playing, we have been building the world. Yeah, so that's how I've been doing it.
Well, yeah, exactly. How far in advance, like beyond the geography, like plot-wise, can you plan, like while taking into account we might, within a play session, we might shift the plot to a pretty different place that you expected. How far is it possible to plan narratively in advance?
So part of the prep for this entire campaign has been asking you guys, my players, to write backgrounds. And so if you get players to write a decent background, that's basically a goldmine. You can delve into that. You can find holes, because there are always holes in people's background stories. They will tell you, I met this person and they did this, but they don't have a full answer as well. Who was that person? Who employed them? Or were they sinister? Were they nice? Who knows? So I use people's backstories to start to create plot points and story beats as we go forward. And that also helps engage you guys into the game. So as you're going along, you go, wait a minute, I know that name. Oh, I know that name from my backstory. I'd like to find out more as to what's going on with that. So it does help engage players into the world a little bit more and makes the world feel a little bit more real. And so I think that's a big part of the prep work that goes into creating a broader world. And then there's points where I will deliberately lay down breadcrumbs, some more delicious than others, and I will know which ones will be tempting for which players. And so every now and again, I will drop one of these breadcrumbs in, and I will have a fair guess that you guys are going to follow it. And so then I will be able to prep ahead for that one. But there are situations where people will do something that's very much out of the scope that you're expecting. Worst case scenario, as a DM, you can just say, okay, I haven't prepared for the next session. Let's end the night at this point and we'll pick up when we come back. So that is literally the worst case scenario. If you don't feel that you on the fly can come up with something to be engaging for your players.
What has been the most unexpected thing that we have done in play that's really kind of thrown you?
Actually, it was a really small thing. So at one point, the players had a document that incriminated some people of certain acts.
Oh, yes. So we were in so our party is called The Firm. We are adventurers, named after the Grisham novel. I can't remember why did we, or was this a Tom Cruise thing?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
It's because we have a character in our party who's basically Tom Cruise.
Yeah, he's a halfling, which is kind of like a off-brand hobbit, who is an actor, very charismatic, perfect teeth, perfect hair, played by Adam in our party, and he is part of the Church of Elzeron, which is a thinly veiled Scientology reference that gets more and more elaborate as we delve into the backstory. But so we were, what was the thing with the document?
So effectively, you had discovered that there was a wizard who was doing dodgy things. At one point, he teleported the entire party into a box.
That's right.
And then you had to find your way out of this magical realm that you got yourselves into, which you did successfully get out of. And once you defeated him, you looked through his study and you found some letters that he was exchanging with other people. One of those letters didn't really mean anything to you guys at the table. It was just, I guess, a bit of flavor that I added to the world, but it was also a potential story link. The character that it mentioned in there, who was like his partner in crime, was actually a real character in the world that I had already prepared.
Was this one of the prophets of Erebus?
No, actually, this was an advisor to another duke.
Oh, the Bonriche's advisor?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so what happened, which was completely unexpected, was one of the players decided to hand this letter over to an advisor of another duke, which you guys didn't know at the time, but the Duke of Bonriche was basically trying to muscle his way into the good graces of the Duke of Alestri. And he's a slimy individual, and he was trying to advance his own kingdom. But the advisor to the Duke of Alestri didn't trust this guy. He just needed some proof that he was dodgy. And effectively, you handed it to him.
Without knowing that
without
was
even knowing it
going on. Yeah.
Yeah. And so because of that, a little bit later in the story, after you ended up at a strange island with a giant crab and you made your way back from that.
That's one of my favorites.
You got to the border of Alestri in the next duchy, and at that point you were all presented with badges, being heroes of the duchy, and even then you still didn't really know why, and it was just like, oh, thanks for the badge.
So it was because we saved the wagon born or something from the giant?
No, it was simply because
we'd ratted on that guy.
Yeah.
Accidentally.
You accidentally ruined a person's life.
He was a bad guy, right?
Well, from your perspective, yes. But yes, so that was a very unexpected moment. And yes, it sort of, it played out in a way where even the players weren't fully aware of the extent of it, but you did eventually get a letter from that advisor, which detailed exactly what had happened. And then you were told, basically, you guys got honorary badges of the realm, because, you stopped a dodgy guy from sneaking in and trying to take advantage of the Duke. So
how much of that is going on in the background, like, of the game, from session to session? Like, are there, plots and movements in motion that, we might sometimes get wind of, but we don't necessarily, we're uninvolved with at this stage. Like, sometimes we've been hearing about, armies amassing at a border in a place we haven't been to yet. Like, are you actually moving pieces around behind the scenes with a purpose? Like,
yes, I am.
Okay.
So the thing is, whenever you're putting together a narrative for your players, it's always good to have the major plot arc and then some minor plot arcs that occur underneath that. And then while people are working through the minor plot arcs, you can do some foreshadowing and drop in a few little interesting informational nuggets. But with the political side of things, I had definitely, before the whole thing started, I actually pieced out, okay, well, who are the countesses, duchesses, dukes of this world? What are their personalities? What are they likely to try and do? Because in this world, it's only been very, very recent that the overarching power has disappeared. You're going to have people who are going to try and expand their empire. You're going to have some who are going to become very defensive and try and turtle themselves. So, yes, there are certainly things that I had figured out in advance, and they are running as well as what you're doing. They're just running in the background.
So those narratives are evolving even though we're not aware of them.
Exactly.
So while we're like on the ground, fighting trolls and wizards and stuff, there is actually a Game of Thrones happening just like in your mind.
Yes.
Like you were saying earlier about your needing a creative outlet and just enjoying it for creativity's sake. Is there an element of that is really like just for your enjoyment? That, like, if it never came into our characters' lives, would you still be happy with that? Because
absolutely. Yeah. No, well, again, it's great just trying to figure out why people are doing things or how things might change. There may be things. We see, going into this, we had quite a few new players at the table, so I wasn't really sure as to what style of gameplay that you'd like and what balance you'd like. As I said before, some people are very combat focused and some people are very intrigue focused. So I needed to have enough things going on that if you guys wanted to get more involved in political intrigue side of things, you could. And if you genuinely wanted to have a political intrigue only game, we could have gone that way. As it's panned out, you guys seem to have wanted a balance of everything, which is great. So there have been some things that I've written and they've played out in the background. You guys may never be aware of it. In saying that as well, that's kind of the same with your backstories. There are some things in people's backstories that may never come up, may never see the light of day, but they're there and they're an opportunity in the future. And it doesn't hurt to have a few extra things in your back pocket.
If there's content you make, like maybe expecting we'll go to this shop or find this cave in a session, but we're
going to talk about Mendelia, the entire town that you guys just didn't go to because you didn't like the sound that they had a disease recently there.
Why would we want to go to Plague Town?
I'm just saying, that was a whole town that I drew the entire map for, and you guys were like, I don't know. Anyone got any ointment? No? Okay, no.
They were warning us not to go there.
So yeah, no, it happens.
But so I'm saying, like with content like that, will you potentially recycle that stuff in the future?
Yeah, and I have already.
Yeah.
There has been some things which, an example, and sorry, spoilers, one of the prime examples was actually from Mendelia. So I had planned out quite a lot for that town, and you guys decided not to go there. So I took one of the set pieces that I was going to do, which was the idea of a guy who effectively... He lived alone, but he believed that his dead family was still alive.
Right.
And so that was something that was very, very easy. I could just unplug from one city and stick it into another because you wouldn't have known. And so, yeah, you ended up involved in that battle and helping a guy rid himself of a lot of evil phantoms and ghosts.
And there's another plague town coming up, isn't there?
Yes, there is another plague town.
And we are planning on getting to that one. We're doing like a loop of the
that one you've been warned pretty heavily about going to, so you can try it.
Oh, okay. We'll see. I find sometimes with the role-playing aspect, because so my character is a deep gnome rogue with a bit of a tragic backstory that we haven't explored entirely yet. But one of the things I had to adjust to was playing a guy who's very dour, and it's a funny group of people we have. We make a lot of jokes, and yeah, sometimes when I am in character as Trapper, this gnome, like I still find myself like saying thank you and please in shops when it's like he probably wouldn't. He's probably not that polite.
No. Well, and that's the thing. It's obviously you are still acting with some level of spontaneity. So there will be moments where your personality will bleed through into the character that you're playing. I don't think that's an entirely bad thing. Because it does make you reflect on that later and go, oh, yeah, actually, no, that seems a bit off-brand. But yeah, no, it's true. And I have previously played a character that was very dry and very introspective. And I found that quite hard because whenever you've got other people at the table who might have very outgoing characters with very bold personalities, sometimes I was sort of feeling like, I don't look like I'm pulling my weight here. I should try and be more introspective. It doesn't really translate.
How do you show that?
Yeah, it's like I'm thinking stuff, guys. Yeah, so there is a balance that you have to strike, and also, I mean, it is about having fun. So, for your character, you've started to introduce a few different things as you've gone along, and even just little quirks, little things. You've got a very, very nice belt that allows you to throw your weapons and they come back to you. And so, yeah, something that you do every now and again when you're traveling is you're just pegging your weapons off into the forest and they come back to you, which again that's something that would be accurate for that character, and it gives that character a little bit more depth.
Another role-playing thing I've kind of had to think about is this thing of breadcrumbs, and that sometimes you'll drop breadcrumbs, and this is where sort of I have to balance, because I grew up playing RPGs, like computer and video game RPGs as well. And in that, I'm much less of a role player because it feels a little silly to role play when it's just a machine there, like you're not actually performing for other people. And I'm probably more of a min-maxer, more a maths guy in those kind of games. But in those games, like it's very natural. It's part of the gameplay to go after every breadcrumb, like because things are literally added to your quest log, and there's like a little empty box that you want to tick if someone says, my sheep have gone missing out on the moor, could you find the wolves that are slaying them? But like playing a real, like a live RPG like this, when a breadcrumb comes across, like I think the first time that we heard the soldiers interacting with what's his name next door, the inventor,
the gnome tinkerer who lives next door, who's under house arrest.
Yes. So there was clearly a story, like a breadcrumb, but I couldn't actually think of a legitimate reason why just hearing soldiers being loud, knocking on this guy's door, why Trapper would actually go and investigate that the first time.
Totally.
So sometimes it's a bit of a struggle to sort of justify why you would go after these breadcrumbs.
Yeah, and that's where a DM needs to be able to start to view things from the player's aspects and go, okay, well, and I dropped a number of breadcrumbs with that particular character, but a lot of it was as you say, I mean, you've got to, as a player, you've got to think, well, this is logical for me to investigate or to look at. And yeah, so it is really a little bit up to the DM at that point to think, okay, the player's not picking up on this. There's a reason they're not picking up on it. And it's the DM's job at that point to think, okay, what's a bigger breadcrumb or a better way of getting a person to interact with the situation? And yes, on the fly, you do sometimes have to come up with new stuff.
And I did eventually, and I'm glad because now I got a really cool crossbow off that guy.
Yeah. I have a question for you.
Sure.
I was curious, what aspects of D&D met your expectations and what didn't?
It's as fun as I thought it would be, and it's one of the things, one of the hobbies in my life I most look forward to doing. Because for probably a couple of years, like I'd heard D&D being played on various podcasts, but yeah, and it always sounded really fun. And like I know those are very, those are performative ones. There is an audience, like literally a live audience. So I knew it wouldn't necessarily be representative, but it always just struck me as something that would be really fun to try. And I think we got very lucky in that we found a group of people who are more or less like-minded in the kind of game we want to play. I think, yeah, part of my thinking did have to adjust from video game RPGs, which, yeah, as I said, like I do have more of a mathematical, practical approach to, and it's, yeah, had to be more, this is more of a fun drama game kind of thing, and you got to do something. I think Philip made a point early on, like we were all dithering about what to do at one point, and he just said, like, we jump out the window or something, because, and he pointed out that, like, you know, this is a game, you're not going to maliciously kill us just for trying something. Like, players get rewarded in D&D for trying unusual scenarios. And I think that was an adjustment I had to make. And you know, for the better, because it's more fun to play that way.
Totally. And that also relates back to communication between players and a DM. I mean, communication is critical in all walks of life, but when it comes to D&D, it's very, very important that, first of all, players feel comfortable communicating with DM, but also that there should be some level of communication prior to even starting a campaign, particularly campaigns because of how long they go for, so that people, first of all, understand what content is acceptable, what's, you know, maybe some subjects which shouldn't be touched on, and basically what they would call a session zero in DM speak, but have a moment where you communicate with your players and you say, okay, so this is the general design of the game, this is the feel of the game, these are some of the themes that will be in the game, are there any themes that people prefer to avoid? And so that way then it helps take, I guess, an awkwardness out of any future moments. You might put a person in a situation that they're not comfortable with, and it does happen. It can happen even after you've had a session zero. But again, it is about that communication between players and DMs and be able to approach someone and say, oh, that wasn't very comfortable for me. Can we either not do that again or whatever? And that's totally cool, and that is how it should be played. You know, it should be an accessible game. And going on from that, a DM needs to be clear with their players as what their expectations are and what style of game that they're likely to play.
Yeah.
Yes, there are DMs out there which are out to kill you. But they should make that very, very clear at the beginning. And some people love that. It's the challenge of how long can I keep my character alive in this world of dangers. And that is a play style. And if everyone at the table is comfortable with that, that's fine. But for me personally, I don't see that as a fun experience, particularly if you've got new players. I don't feel that it's fair because they don't really know all the mechanics and what they can and cannot get away with. So yeah, in my games, I'm very reluctant to kill somebody's character if they just tried something, unless I've warned them intensely not to try something and they've ignored that and gone and done it anyway, like swimming in a volcano. Not that any of my players have tried that one yet, but just saying.
It could be fun, like maybe for a one shot to do, you know, hard mode. Like perhaps if you remove the the risk from the regular player characters. Like maybe for this one session, like all the player characters possessed some sort of avatar in some sort of like battle royale situation in which like the avatars could die, but it wouldn't have an effect on the main players.
Well, there is a pre-made module called Tomb of Horrors, which would really lend itself to that, where effectively you're just going around chamber after chamber getting the living daylights beaten out of you. So, yeah, you can do it if you want.
So you created this new world of Imria for this campaign. Has there been any material from the official D&D modules that you've used?
No, actually. I think part of it was that, as I said, I'm a little bit addicted to creative things. So I wanted to make my own world, but also part of making your own world as a DM, it gives you a little bit more insight and a little bit more control, and you can feel more knowledgeable going forward. So if you know how things generally are going to work and you know how generally things are laid out, you don't have to refer back to some book that you've got. You can just surge ahead and say, okay, no, this is how it's going to work. So there's definitely a part of it which, yes, it's a lot more work, but the flip side is that as a DM, you are more confident moving forward in that world. So I've sort of steered away from bringing in any of the module content.
Was it a steep learning curve learning how to improvise and react to what we're doing?
Oh, well, yes and no. The first couple of sessions that I ever ran were intense moments, and I would feel nervous. And
how many games have you run before ours?
I'd been a player in a few. I'd done a one shot with some other people, but to be honest, yeah, the campaign that we're running is one of the first games that I've been a DM for. So, and yeah, the first couple of sessions were intense because you've been put behind this amazing machine and everyone's expecting you to produce something. But there is also a side where you can make it easy on yourself. You don't have to, trying to make some amazing backstory thing going on. It could literally just be a single dungeon that has a group of enemies in it, and you just work your way through it. So you can, if you're wanting to get into being a DM and you find it a little confronting, just start small. And it doesn't mean that that's bad or boring or anything. You might just have a local town full of grumpy people because the latest shipment of ale didn't show up, and they know that a group of goblins has stolen the ale, so you've got to go and get the ale from the goblins, and there's the start of an adventure. And then you can go from there, and you might say maybe the goblins aren't the bad guys. Maybe there's a ogre that moved into the area that's telling them, if you don't supply me with food and beverage, I'll start eating goblins. So, that the adventure can keep rolling forward, and you can go from very simple beginnings if you want to. So, yeah, but in the way I did it, yes, the first couple of sessions were a little bit nerve-wracking.
I've had an idea for a one-shot, but yeah, I think that would be the most intimidating thing to me is like, because even as a player sometimes I don't know how to react to some situations. I feel like I just can't think fast enough, and let alone having to manage, the actions of another 5 players or whatever.
Well, the thing to keep in mind, though, is that there is a big difference between a campaign game and a one-shot.
Yeah.
Usually with a one-shot, you're looking at what the term is railroading.
Yeah.
But you really are looking at railroading people on a one-shot because you don't have time for people to just fluff about and do whatever they want. I mean, you can do a sandbox one shot, but just be aware it's probably going to go pretty weird. But absolutely, with the one shots that I've done, they have been quite severely constrained in the sense of how far the players can go. But there's enough there that people want to move forward in the way that you're expecting to move forward. And so it gives you a little bit more confidence as a DM. You're like, okay, I know where the story is going. I know the NPCs they're going to run into. I'm pretty much set. Also helps to have a couple of really nice looking props. that always wins people over.
I imagine like every D&D group, and I've only been in this one, but every group must be pretty different in terms of group dynamics. Like what What are some things like in the group we have that you didn't see in other groups, or things that are missing, or how are we different?
Well, the one-shots that I've run have been sort of for my local community that I'm in, and the makeup of the groups is completely different. I have a much broader age range, much broader, and also nearly all of them are women, which doesn't really change the game per se, but it is just another side of it where you're thinking, okay, well, I've got to come up with a story that's going to engage a broad audience. You know, what can I do? And in that sense, that's quite different than the campaign, because with a campaign, even if you have one session that's a little bit off, that people aren't really gelling with, next week you can come up with something exciting and get back on track. Whereas with a one-shot, it's a little bit tougher to win people over in a matter of minutes. So yeah, with one-shots, I will go a little bit above and beyond with those and really think critically about what I'm doing. And it does have to relate to the group. So if I've got, maybe a lot of younger people, I need to think, okay, well, there's some themes I probably need to avoid. And, there are people out there like the DM for their kids. Obviously, you need to keep it appropriate for the people who are playing. So, yes, depending on the group, you need to tailor the game to suit them, and don't go super dark and gritty if you don't know the people.
Yeah.
It would be a good way of approaching it. But other than that, I've actually found that between the two groups, there hasn't been a lot of difference. The thing is, it seems for some people who are new to it, which many of these players are, they've still got this amazing wide-eyed reaction of, oh my God, this is D&D, this is amazing. So yeah, you don't have to try too hard beyond that point to impress them.
I've still got a bit of that feeling, I think.
It's not a bad thing.
Yeah. Because it is supposed to, I guess, the DM is like you're a storyteller, you're supposed to be keeping play within a set of rules, and you're also sort of a social facilitator. Do those roles ever come into conflict? Like, say, and because it is a game that is based on chance, it is based on dice rolls, is there ever a point where, the rules are saying one thing, but that's not going to be fun for anyone?
Yes. There has been one situation in one of my one-shots that I was a little bit annoyed with, and it was just simply... It was a moment of bad judgment on my behalf and also bad dice rolls. I had a person who'd never played before, and they were asking me what characters can they play, and I had pre-generated some characters. I had also gone the extra mile and deliberately toned down the characters so they were a lot easier for people to operate compared to just the ones out of the player's handbook. But this person really liked the idea of playing this monk character. And I had recommended that they try something a bit more straightforward, like a barbarian character, which is very easy to learn. But no, they really wanted to play this monk character. I'm like, okay, that's fine. It's your thing. And so we got into it. And I think the person's highest dice roll the entire night was like a 5 out of 20.
Wow.
It was everything this person did was a failure. And it was one of those situations where I was thinking as a DM, okay, I've got to solve this, but there was literally a hard limit. I can't say to a player, you don't have to roll this time, you just win. Because everyone else at the table would be like, well, wait, why can't I do that? So I did still have to adhere to at least some of the rules. And that was a situation where I had no control over it, and it unfortunately didn't go very well. And I have a feeling that, maybe for more than one reason, but I think that was part of the reason that they're a little reluctant to come and play again, which saddens me. But those situations can't really be helped. But also, something I particularly like about the 5th edition is what we're playing. The designers of the game have been very clear, saying that the rules are only guidelines. So if you want to change those rules as a DM, go right ahead. And that's where it's a bit easier to accommodate something you might think is fun or may not adhere to the rules. You can do it. Just manipulate it to work. And yeah, as a DM, you can make mistakes. You might make an item overpowered, or you might accidentally put an enemy in front of your players who's way too dangerous for what they can handle. You can just change it on the fly. Don't have to tell anyone. You can keep that to yourself, but you can change these things. And worst case scenario, if you've gone and put something into the world, let's say you've given a player an item that's way too powerful, and you realize several fights on, this isn't working out. Again, just communicate with your players and say, I stuffed up here. We're going to have to detune that. And yeah, it's very versatile in that respect.
And I guess there are normally, because the party's very diverse, every character has their own set of skills, there's normally more than one way of solving a problem. So like if my rogue character consistently fails my lockpicking rolls to open a door, like Bandar could potentially try breaking it down.
Yeah, no, exactly. And a DM has to use their discretion, because whenever you're calling for a dice roll, effectively what you're saying is there is a chance that you might fail at this.
And if there's a chance a character might fail, you as the DM have to have another way this scenario can go.
Exactly. And so if it's something that, let's say it's something that's pivotal to the plot, that you know that a character has to find this to progress the story, don't put a dice roll in front of it. Just let them find it, because all it would take is them to accidentally roll a 1, and then what do? It's like, oh, well, that was the end of that story, everyone. Back to the tavern. So there is points where a DM has to sort of have a little bit of foresight and think, yeah, okay, well, maybe make this super easy, or just it happens.
Yeah.
And yeah, having that's the other part of yes and, which is a really big part of D&D. If a person says, oh, I want to try and do something crazy, let's say I chop down one of the chandeliers and I want to use the chain of the chandeliers to swing out the window and flip up to the next level so I can break in and help the person who's failed their lockpicking check. Well, say yes. The answer is yes. Like, yeah, go for it. And you might have to make them make a roll for something as extreme as that, but still, it gives them one more opportunity to succeed, and why not?
And if they fail, have them fail in an entertaining way.
Oh, yeah. There's so many possible ways that you can add either a bit of comic flair or
that leads to a different opportunity.
Exactly. The thing is that even Critical Role, they are relatively new players, actually, most of them, but they've been playing now for a number of years. Even they, every now and again, have moments where things have gone horribly wrong. And yeah, they just, as a group and also with the DM, they just have to try and figure out, okay, how can we make this work? And maybe it's not salvageable without breaking the game. And if it gets to that point, if you've genuinely stuffed up so badly, you can still sit down with your players and say, well, we've stuffed it. Do you want to rewind, or how do you want to deal with it from this point? We can start new characters, or we can go back to where you hadn't made this bad decision. So everything can be fixed.
And I guess that's the benefit also of a fantasy setting, is that you can always, a wizard did it away. You can have ridiculous Deus Ex Machinas come in to change everything.
Oh, totally. Yeah, no, there have been occasions where I've had to think on my feet. I'm like, it's magic. It's magic. Just say it was magic. Magic happened.
Was there anything else you wanted to go over?
Well, I would like to say, just for people out there who are listening to this, who are thinking, maybe I should give it a go. First of all, give it a go. Second of all, being a DM is not hard at all. I highly recommend some resources. So apart from just watching a couple of episodes of Critical Role, see how they do it. You might like that style. Secondly, as I said before, Running the Game is a series of videos done by Matt Colville, which you can find on YouTube. They are so full of good information. There's other resources, of course, like you can watch Twitch streams, but on YouTube you can find videos like from Sartine Phoenix, WebDM, Taking 20, Dungeon Dudes, Dale Kingsmill from Monarch's Factory. She's got an interesting video on how she organizes her binder, which is actually a really useful skill. So, I highly, highly recommend people give it a go. And D&D really is something that is accessible to an exceptionally broad audience. And I think it really is a very special thing that allows us to come together and genuinely engage with each other. And I think that that's something that is missing a lot in people's lives. I mean, sure, we're more connected these days than ever before, but we're not actually engaged. We are connected, but not engaged. And that's what D&D allows, is people to come together in person, hopefully, to share an experience. And as well as that, it gives you an opportunity to inhabit a character, which the character itself might be different from you, might be a different gender, socioeconomic outlook, different cultural background, different personality, any number of things that this character can have. And then you will inhabit that character. And I guess relating back to the whole theme of your podcast, through that, I think you can develop empathy for that character. And that empathy, hopefully you can translate that into the real world and start breaking down some barriers that exist between us. And I think that's a good thing.
Well said, Brooke. I think the other thing to mention is D&D isn't the only RPG in the game as well.
No. Oh, God, there are so many. So many.
Like if fantasy isn't your thing, I mean, there's Shadowrun is a well-established sci-fi, future punk kind of thing. Call of Cthulhu is a horror-based one. I'm sure that there are probably like more mundane domestic RPGs out there
well,
too, aren't there?
An interesting one is Weave. It's based on a deck of cards and then a smartphone or smart device. And then you can load in different overall themes into your smart device, and then you use the cards to help generate the story as you move forward. And that one you can go from like slice of life all the way through to sci-fi crazy fantasy.
You could probably, I'm sure there probably is a Friends-themed running Central Perk Cafe RPG out there.
Yeah, there would be. And if there isn't, make it.
Yeah.
And that's the thing is D&D, even though it's generally set in a fantasy world, you can still modify it to suit you. And if you want Wild West or space or whatever, you can do it. It's a little bit of work sometimes, but hey, hopefully the payoff will be worthwhile.
Brooke, thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's been a great experience.
If all this talk of Dungeons and Dragons has piqued your interest, there are heaps and heaps and heaps of shows online you can listen to and watch for free of people playing it, if you're curious. So Brooke recommends Critical Role. That seems to be the absolutely most popular one out there. I enjoy Acquisitions Incorporated by Penny Arcade. I've heard The Adventure Zone is a good one. They're just, Google best D&D podcasts. There are so many out there. And if you're interested in playing yourself, try your local comic book shop or nerd place, anywhere that sells miniature anythings. Here in Brisbane, the bar Netherworld do a regular D&D night that is welcoming to beginners. And it's really fun. Can recommend. Notes and corrections and follow-ups for this episode. Brooke mentioned the cost of higher education in New Zealand being a factor in his parents' decision to emigrate to Australia. And sure enough, New Zealand had no student loan program until 1992. But they do now for both tuition fees and living expenses. By comparison, at that time, Australia had totally abolished university fees as of 1974 under the Whitlam government, and they were only slowly reintroduced from 1989 with support offered under the Higher Education Contribution Scheme, or HECS. Was the word grimdark invented for Warhammer 40,000? The term grimdark, describing a fictional setting that is overbearingly oppressive, does seem to have originated from a tagline used in marketing for the tabletop game Warhammer 40k, which went, "In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war." Brooke referenced 4X games at one point in reference to the Civilization series of computer strategy games. Being a podcast produced in Queensland, I feel obliged to clarify that a 4X game is not related to the disgusting beer brewed here in Brisbane. 4X games are a subgenre of strategy game where your four primary goals are the exploration of the environment, expansion of your territory, exploitation of resources, and extermination of rival players. The term was coined in 1993 by the writer Alan Emmerich in a preview of the game Master of Orion that was published in Computer Gaming World. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you want more, there are lots just like it. Possibly none quite so nerdy as this one. But get on that. However you get podcasts. And if you want, you can email me at gimmeempathypodcast@gmail.com or on Instagram at gimmeempathypodcast, Facebook. Do the thing. Do what you need to do. And then do it again. Until next time, stay rolling. Rolling.